The lake had frozen 2 weeks early that year, which the old-timers in Flin Flon said meant a hard winter coming. Callum Dryden had stopped listening to old-timers a long time ago. He had stopped listening to most things. He was driving the highway back from town. 40 minutes of nothing, just spruce trees and the gray sky pressing down like a lid, when he saw them on the shoulder. At first he thought it was a garbage bag someone had tossed. Then the bag moved. He pulled over without deciding to. That was something the therapist in Winnipeg had once said about him. You act before you think, Callum. She had meant it as a problem. He had stopped seeing her, too. He left the truck running and walked back through the cold. The temperature had dropped hard in the last hour, the kind of drop that feels personal, like the weather has chosen you specifically. His breath came in short white bursts. There were 3 of them huddled in the ditch at the edge of the gravel. A dog, a large one, a shepherd mix with a coat that had gone gray-brown with ice and mud and pressed flat against her belly, 2 puppies so small they looked unfinished. The mother was shaking in a way that had gone past shivering into something deeper, some cellular-level tremor that Callum recognized. He had seen it in men. That shake meant the body was making calculations about which parts of itself it could afford to lose. She looked up at him. She did not growl. She did not flinch away. She just looked at him with dark eyes that had already run the numbers and arrived at a kind of exhausted trust. Not because she believed he was good, but because she had run out of other options. Callum crouched down in the gravel. He stayed there a moment, the cold working through his jeans. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "All right." He took off his jacket and laid it flat on the truck bed. He went back and picked up the puppies first, one at a time, and put them on the jacket. The mother watched this with those calculating eyes. When he reached for her, she was stiff and heavy, her limbs half-locked, but she didn't fight him. She made a sound, not a whimper, more like a long, slow exhale, and let him lift her. He drove the rest of the way home with the heater on full and one hand on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, he could see her raising her head, looking at the puppies, then lowering it again. The cabin had belonged to his uncle first, then to a cousin who had no use for it, and then, through a series of transactions nobody had expected, to Callum. He had moved in 3 years ago with 2 duffel bags and a box of tools and very little else. The nearest neighbor was 2 kilometers down the road. The nearest town was 40. He had, at the time, considered this a feature. He had served 12 years with JTF2 before they medically released him. And before that he had done 2 rotations with the PPCLI. And before that he had been a 19-year-old from a small town in northern Manitoba who had signed his name on a form without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. He was 44 now. The things he had agreed to had left their marks in places that didn't show on X-rays. His dog, a Belgian Malinois named Brecken, had served with him on 2 deployments. When Brecken died 18 months ago, Callum had not replaced him. He had not replaced anything. He had stayed in the cabin and done the firewood and the fishing and the maintenance work that a property like this demanded. And he had let the days pass the way days do when you stop expecting anything of them. He set the mother and pups up in the mudroom with an old horse blanket and a plastic tote with low sides that he'd used for storing kindling. He boiled water and made a warm mash. He had dry dog food left over, a habit he hadn't broken, and he put it in front of her with a bowl of water. She ate with a focus that was almost frightening. The puppies had found their way to her underside. The smallest one, a pale gray pup with one ear that flopped and one that stood, had a tremor in its back legs that Callum didn't like the look of. He sat on the floor of the mudroom with his back against the wall and watched them until the shaking eased and the mother's breathing slowed. Outside, the wind had picked up. She was still alive in the morning, which he had not entirely counted on. Callum made coffee and stood in the mudroom doorway and looked at the 3 of them. The mother was awake, watching him from over the rim of the tote, her chin resting on the edge of the plastic. The larger pup was sleeping hard. The gray one, the small one with the unsteady back legs, was awake too, pressing itself against its mother's front paw as if trying to hold her in place. He called the vet in Flin Flon. The vet, a woman named Dr. Price who had treated Brecken for 6 years, and who had a manner so direct, it sometimes felt like an argument, told him to bring them in that afternoon. It was a long drive. The mother lay in the back seat on the horse blanket and stared at the ceiling with something that looked, to Callum, like resignation. He found himself talking, which was not a thing he did. He said things like "you're all right" and "not much farther," and once, at a long stretch of empty road, he said, I know, it's a lot." He was not sure who he was saying that last one to. Dr. Price examined all three of them with the quiet efficiency of someone who did not traffic in drama. The mother was malnourished and had been through a recent whelping that had not been easy on her. The large pup was underweight but otherwise fine. The gray pup had a mild neurological issue. Not serious, Dr. Price said, but something to watch. He would always be a little unsteady, probably. He would have to be careful with him. Callum stood with his arms crossed and looked at the gray pup sitting on the examination table. The gray pup looked back at him. He had pale amber eyes, which seemed wrong, too old for such a small face. "You keeping them?" Dr. Price asked, without looking up from her notes. Callum didn't answer right away. He thought about the cabin. He thought about the mudroom. He thought about how the mornings had been lately, before he found them on the shoulder. "Yeah," he said. The woman who lived 2 kilometers down the road was named Frances Okafor, and Callum had spoken to her maybe 8 times in 3 years. She was in her mid-60s, had moved up from Thunder Bay after her husband died, and kept a large property that she managed with a competence that seemed effortless from the outside. He had helped her once with a fallen tree across her lane. She had brought him a jar of wild blueberry preserves the following week, which he still had, unopened, in the back of a cupboard. She came to his door 11 days after he brought the dogs home. He heard the knock and stood in the kitchen for a moment, not entirely sure what to do with it. Then he went and opened the door. She was standing on the step casserole dish covered in foil, and an expression that was not quite a smile but was close to one. She had a way of looking at things that made Callum feel assessed without feeling judged, which was unusual. "I heard you found some dogs," she said. "News travels," Callum said. "Wayne at the gas station mentioned it. He said you came in for puppy milk replacer, looking like a man who had never bought puppy milk replacer before. That's accurate." She looked at him for a moment. He stepped back from the door and let her in. The mother, Callum had been calling her Ash without fully deciding to, came to the kitchen doorway and regarded Frances the same way she had regarded Callum that first night. That running of the numbers. Frances crouched down immediately, not reaching out, just making herself smaller. "Hello," she said, to the dog. "You've had a time of it." The gray pup came barreling in from behind his mother. His walk was always a little sideways, a little improvised, like a boat compensating for wind, and went directly to Frances's boots and began attacking a loose bit of lace. "That one," Frances said, her voice shifting into something warmer, "is trouble." "He doesn't know it yet," Callum said. Frances stayed for an hour. She talked about the winter, about a project she was doing on her property, about a family of ravens that had taken up residence in the spruce trees near her barn. Callum mostly listened, which was what he was good at, and also what he defaulted to when he wasn't sure what else to do. At some point, the conversation moved the way some conversations do. Not pushed, just drifting, toward the thing underneath. She had lost her husband 4 years ago. A sudden thing, a Tuesday morning, no warning. She talked about it the way people talk about something they have processed many times and have reached a kind of truce with, though the truce is never entirely comfortable. The first winter was the worst, she said. Not because of the cold, because of all the sounds that were missing. Callum was quiet for a moment. The fire was going. Ash was lying under the table with the large pup, tucked against her back. The gray pup had fallen asleep across Frances's foot. "What sounds?" he said. She thought about it. Footsteps on the floor above me. Someone putting a cup down on the counter. The particular sound the front door made when he came back. She shook her head. "You don't know the sounds are there until they aren't." Callum looked down at his coffee. He knew the sounds. Not the same ones. Brecken's nails on the hardwood at 4 in the morning. The sound of the dog door swinging. The particular way a Belgian Malinois breathes when it's asleep. This deep, even rhythm that had once, in a tent, in a country he was not going to name out loud, been the thing that got him through the night. He didn't say any of that, but Frances, he thought, probably understood the shape of it anyway. The gray pup's name came to him 2 weeks after. He was outside splitting wood in the early morning, and the pup came stumbling out the back door. He had figured out the dog door 4 days ahead of his brother despite everything, and sat in the snow and looked at the trees with an expression of total unconcerned interest, as if the cold was somebody else's problem. Callum stopped with the axe. He stood there looking at the pup in the blue early light. The pup's name was Gus. He didn't know where it came from, he just knew it was right. He went inside and looked at the larger pup, who had been sleeping in a tidy circle in front of the wood stove. He thought about this one differently. Steadier, quieter, watchful in a way that reminded him of certain people he had served with. Good people. The kind who didn't say much and meant everything they said. He named that one Rook. Ash, Gus, and Rook. He said the 3 names out loud in the empty kitchen, and it felt, for reasons he couldn't entirely account for, like something clicking back into place. The question that had been sitting at the edge of his mind since he'd found them, who left them there? And why, resolved itself on a Thursday in late January when a man showed up at his gate. He was in his 50s, with a face that had been weathered down to something essential, and he stood at the end of the driveway with his hat in his hands, like a person preparing to receive a verdict. His name was Ferris Dole. He had owned the mother. He called her Sheba, and had left for a week to deal with a family situation in Saskatchewan. He had left her with a neighbor who had, it turned out, decided that a pregnant dog was more than he'd bargained for, and had driven her out on the highway and left her. Ferris stood in the driveway and told this story with the flat economy of someone who had already been through every emotional stage of it and had arrived at bare fact. His hands kept turning the hat brim. "I don't expect you to give her back," he said. "I know I don't have a right to. I needed to know she was all right." Callum looked at the man for a long moment. He thought about Ash in the ditch with the snow building up on her back, shaking that deep, terrible shake. He thought about Ferris driving back from Saskatchewan to an empty yard, and the word neighbor taking on a new and specific weight. He invited Ferris inside. He made coffee. He brought Ash out from the mudroom, and Ferris went down on one knee on the kitchen floor, and she went to him. Not frantic, but sure, the way dogs go to the people who are theirs. She pressed her head under his chin and stayed there. Gus investigated Ferris's bootlaces with great scientific seriousness. Rook sat at a distance and watched everything. They talked for 2 hours. Callum said very little about himself, but Ferris was the kind of man who filled silence without demanding anything from it, which Callum had always found restful. At some point they talked about the winter and the highway and what it meant to trust the wrong person. When Ferris got up to go, he stood in the doorway for a moment. "You were in the service," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Callum said. Ferris nodded slowly, the way certain men nod when something confirms what they already knew. "My youngest was in the airborne. 3 years. He doesn't talk about it much." Callum said nothing. "He doesn't have to," Ferris said. "I just want him to know I'm not going anywhere." He put his hat on. "Anyway, thank you for looking after her." He drove away down the road. Callum stood at the window and watched the truck go, and felt something in the vicinity of his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. February came in difficult. A week of temperatures that made the cabin groan at night, the beams contracting in the cold. Callum kept the fire going around the clock and found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not mind the disruption. There was a logic to tending a fire, a physical requirement that had a beginning and an end. He had always done better with that kind of thing. The dogs had established their routines. Ash slept in the mudroom by preference, near the door, which Callum understood. Rook slept in the doorway of the bedroom, a position that seemed strategic rather than affectionate. Gus slept wherever he had fallen, which was sometimes the couch, sometimes the rug, once in the bottom of the laundry basket in a way that raised more questions than it answered. Gus was not, by conventional measures, an easy dog. His back legs continued to be a negotiation rather than a commitment. He ran with a side-to-side motion that looked like controlled falling. He could not always manage the back step without assistance, which meant Callum had built a low wooden ramp the 3rd week of January. He was prone to getting his collar caught on things. He was not deterred by any of this. He had an unself-conscious enjoyment of his own existence that Callum found genuinely disorienting. It was not that Callum didn't like the dog. It was that the dog's approach to being alive was so different from Callum's own that being around him felt like instruction. One morning, a Thursday, still dark, the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze on the first breath, Callum went to the back window with his coffee and saw Gus sitting in the snow in the gray pre-dawn. Just sitting, head up, looking at the tree line, not doing anything in particular. Callum watched him for a while. There was a thing that Callum had been carrying for a long time that he did not have a clean name for. The closest he had come was weight, which was not very precise. It was the weight of the things he'd seen, and the things he hadn't been able to stop, and the things he'd done, and the specific weight of Brecken, going quiet on the floor of the vet clinic, with his head in Callum's lap, which was a different weight from all the rest, quieter and more personal. He had been carrying that weight the way you carry a pack on a long march, not thinking about it, just compensating for it, adjusting your posture, moving differently than you would otherwise move. Gus turned and looked at him through the window. The dog did not appear to find anything unusual about the man standing in the dark kitchen at 5 in the morning, watching him sit in the snow. He wagged his tail twice, efficiently, and then turned back to the trees. Callum finished his coffee. He put the cup down. He went and got his coat. Frances came by twice more in February, once with firewood to trade. Her stack had a better burn than his. Birch cut the previous spring, and once without reason or with a reason she didn't state, which was its own kind of reason. She brought her reading and sat at the kitchen table, and they were each quiet in their own way, which was not the same as being lonely. She told him once, while the dogs were in varying states of afternoon collapse around the kitchen, that when she was first in the house alone, she had started leaving the radio on all night. Not to listen to it, just to have a voice. Then one morning I woke up and turned it off, she said, and the house was quiet and I thought, I can manage this. She poured more coffee. It was just a Tuesday. Nothing had changed. I just thought it. How long after he died? Callum asked. 8 months. He nodded. It doesn't happen all at once, she said, which is the thing the books don't tell you. You just wake up one day, and the weight is the same, but you're carrying it better. She looked at Gus, who had arranged himself under the table in a position that defied geometry. Or something comes along that gives you a reason to get out of bed before you've decided you're ready to. Callum looked down at the table. You didn't come out here to be alone, Frances said. It was not an accusation, more like a correction. I didn't know what I came out here to be, he said. No, she said. Most people don't. That's why they go somewhere quiet. To hear themselves think. And if you don't like what you hear... She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then you keep listening, she said, until you get to the part that's still worth something. March in northern Manitoba is not a gentle thing. The cold breaks in stages, like a negotiation, and each time you think it's done, there's another hard week that reminds you it isn't. The snow doesn't melt so much as it retreats, grudgingly, leaving behind the debris of the winter. Sticks, gravel, things you'd lost in November. Callum started running again in March. He hadn't run since he left the service, or not regularly. He went out early with all 3 dogs, which was its own kind of operation. Rook ran steady and close, matching pace. Ash ran well but held slightly back, always monitoring, as if she were running with a unit she wasn't entirely sure about yet. Gus ran with his sideways improvised gallop, falling behind and then surging forward, and then getting distracted by something in a ditch, and then surging forward again to catch up. It was not efficient. It was not the kind of running he'd done in training, which had been about output and endurance, and the suppression of everything that wasn't forward motion. It was better, somehow. He was not sure how to account for this. One morning in late March he stopped at the top of the rise on the road, the one that looked out over the lake, which had lost its solid center and was going gray and uncertain at the edges. And he stood with his hands on his knees and caught his breath, and Gus crashed into the back of his legs and stood there panting with his whole back end going, and Callum laughed. Out loud, a short, rusty sound. He straightened up. The lake was out there, gray and breaking apart at the edges, becoming itself again. Rook sat beside him with the exact posture of a dog waiting for an order. Ash stood a little apart, looking at the tree line. Gus had fallen over in the snow and was getting up again without any apparent concern. Callum stood at the top of the rise and breathed the cold, clean air. 12 years in. 3 tours, 1 dog who had sat with him through the worst of it, and who had, in the end, left him the way the best ones do. Quietly, without drama, without asking him to make it mean anything other than what it was. He hadn't been able to say out loud, since Brecon, that he was going to be all right. He hadn't been able to get there. He had known the words and felt the distance between knowing them and meaning them, and that distance had been its own kind of landscape to cross. He wasn't sure, standing on the rise in the last of the March cold, that he was entirely across it. But he could see where it ended. He could make out the edge from here. He whistled for the dogs and turned back toward the cabin. In April, he called his brother in Portage la Prairie, something he hadn't done in almost a year. His brother, whose name was Stuart, and who had the particular quality of a man who has learned not to push, answered on the second ring and said nothing more than hey and waited. Callum told him about the dogs. He started with finding them on the highway and went through the vet visit and Gus and the ramp and Ferris Dalton Francis and the running in the early mornings. He talked for longer than he'd talked in months. His brother didn't interrupt him. When Callum finally stopped, there was a moment of quiet. "You sound different," Stuart said. "Different how? I don't know, like yourself." Callum didn't say anything to that. He sat in the kitchen with the phone and looked at Gus asleep across his feet, and Rook in the doorway doing his watching, and Ash by the door with her nose at the gap, reading whatever was out there. "I found them on the shoulder," he said again, not because his brother needed to hear it twice, but because he needed to say it twice. "They were just there." "Yeah," Stuart said. Outside the snow was going. The mud beneath it was dark and rich, and smelled like something that had been waiting a long time to be itself again. Callum made a note that afternoon to find out where he'd put the blueberry preserves.